Let me just say right off the bat that if you're expecting some deep, interesting, or otherwise philosophical video on this, that this is not the video for you, because I have no such deep, well thought out, philosophical, anything worth listening to's today. This is probably going to be a short video, too, because I don't have much to talk about, but I'll get to that. I want to start with gameplay, as I often prefer to. I'm reminded of Head-On Blood Right, which is a game I covered somewhat recently, which is an RPG built in the bones of Doom, an FPS. This is a puzzle game built in the bones of Serious Sam, an FPS. But I don't mean the FPS connector. I mean it felt like a developer wanted to just kind of make something and stretched out and did it, and here we have it. And in both cases, I feel like I applaud the effort more than I applaud the result. But I want to add an asterisk to that, because in both cases, it's clear that as the levels progressed, and as the puzzles progressed, they were getting better at them. Now, there's kind of an asterisk on top of this, because some of the early puzzles are extraordinarily well designed. Some of the first puzzles you go through are great, and you're probably thinking, they're so easy, Lore. One of the things I talk about a lot, one of the things I value so much in game design, is tutorialization without a text box or a voiceover. We've talked about this concept a lot. It's one of the reasons I praise Super Mario World so much, for that matter. There are ways to simply design the world and what you can interact with how and when in order to tutorialize. One of my favorite examples is right off the beginning. I ran into a puzzle. It was like the third puzzle in the game, and I'm like, this is impossible. Because I have this little, this little jammer, and if I push this right here in front of this thing, the bomb's going to come out and blow me up. That's impossible. And as I looked at that, I realized there was a section of it where you could see in the distance, and as you see in the distance, you can see one of the things you can jam. It was just visually drawing your attention to a target while you have something you can hit that target with. And so as a random throw, I was like, okay, and I found out that the jammers actually have technically infinite range. They have visual range. And I was like, oh, and there's all sorts of examples of that in the early game. It's great. Here's the caveat. There are actually certain aspects of the gameplay of how certain things interact with other things that are not tutorialized. I will go ahead and freely admit I actually looked up a guide on several of the puzzles in this game. Don't ask me how many. I don't remember. It was like 5 or so. And each one of them is... Well, okay, there were 2 examples of these. One was something where I just frickin' failed. Like the first Gehenna puzzle. I couldn't do that for whatever reason. Couldn't figure out the angles. But the other type of thing is where I'm like, that's how that works? Because it never even occurred to me that it would work that way. There weren't many of those. Like I said, it was only single digit range. But that did happen periodically. And there were certain things the game just kind of doesn't tell you how it works. And I don't just mean in terms of core gameplay, because did you know there's a fast forward button in this game? I'm glad I did, because someone told me that. If someone hadn't told me that, I never would have figured that out, because nothing in the game tells you that. Yes, I know it wasn't in at launch. It doesn't matter. The fact is, nothing ever indicates that is there. And that's problematic, because that's extremely useful, especially when you do the timing puzzles with the freaking recording thing. There's also certain specific elements of how things, like when you get down to the nitty-gritty of how crossed beams work, or of how certain recording objects interact with their past versions of themselves that aren't really tutorials. You just kind of have to figure it out for yourself. And in some cases, certain things only occurred to me because I was like, oh, that won't work. Click. Oh, that works. Interesting. Like, there's this one puzzle, spoilers, but there's one puzzle where I had to get a box up here. And apparently, if you have 2 fans, this only happens this one time. You have 2 fans pointing in the same direction. The box just is up in the air, which I had no idea. I had no idea that would work that way, and nothing seemed to indicate it until I did it, literally just to try it, and lo and behold. Whether this is a good game design or bad design is up to you, of course. I'm just mentioning that it goes from extremely well tutorialized to not so much. But the puzzle designs are okay in the vanilla game. There are a few that really stand out, and I gave a few positives here and there, but for the most part, it was mostly okay. Most of them didn't really sing to me, so to speak. And I will go ahead and jump ahead a little bit and mention that during the outro, on the final floor, whatever it is, of the tower, that puzzle kind of sucked. And you're probably thinking, but why, Lore? Because it's long, and you have to start over from the very beginning every time you screw up, because there are no mid-mission checkpoints. and there is a timer. And that timer is a form of raspberry jam. It makes it much harder to see what you're doing and what you can interact with. None of those things are good, and those things combined led to a negative. Which is a shame, because from a narrative access, the ascent through the tower is kind of awesome. Before I move on to the narrative, though, I do want to talk about the Gehenna puzzles, because this is what I referred to earlier. The Gehenna is the DLC, for those of you not aware, which I highly recommend you pick up if you pick up this game. Which I do recommend you pick up this game, by the way. It's good stuff. But the thing is, the Gehenna DLC is just better. Other than that one puzzle I got mega stuck on, which can go to hell, pretty much all the puzzle designs in Gehenna were much better. There were a couple I looked up, one of which was literally just because of time, so whatever. But for the most part, like the crater, for example. The crater was an awesome puzzle that it gave you tools, and that's kind of my point. A lot of the puzzles in the main game, a lot of the specific sequences felt very restrictive. And I don't just mean in the obvious way because they want you to solve the puzzle in a certain way. I mean, they restricted your options, your availability, how you could play with it, how you could look at it, etc. To use the exact example I just mentioned, in the crater puzzle, it's kind of an open world puzzle, which they started doing in the Gehenna DLC. So you can just go out, and here's the whole crater, and you can get up top here, on top of the rim or whatever, and look down into the caldera and be like, aha, that's there and that's there. And you can kind of have a bit of a mental map, or you could have a literal map. You can just see down there. It's like, okay, this goes here and this goes here. And it was very helpful, which is especially important because one of the only complaints I had, not a negative, but certainly something that the game could have used is some kind of mini map mode or like an overhead camera mode or something where you can just take a moment and get a little bit of, little spatial awareness of what's where and how to try and plan out things, because some of these get rather complicated. But overall, the Gehenna DLCs were really good. The Gehenna DLC puzzles were really good. Sorry, I'm really tired. And I had a lot of fun with that part of it. But now is when I talk about the story. I'm going to go ahead and mention that I literally cannot talk about this story at all without spoiling its core premise. So this is your big warning. If you have not played this game and want to go in blind, or which I do recommend, by the way, go ahead and pause or stop or delete me, or just send giant flaming space watermelons after me, or whatever it is you're going to do, because this is your spoiler warning, and I think that's enough time for a spoiler warning. So you play a program, a bot, more specifically, that is going through a sequence of logic puzzles and a bunch of other stuff in order to try and generate a true level of what could be qualified as sentient and sapient, because humanity's dead, because, ? The thing I read was about a whole a virus being released, but who knows? It's rules magic. Don't worry about it. It's a tale. It's not a story, it's a tale. Because the rule is all humanity's wiped out, which is silly, because someone's going to survive somewhere, right? But whatever, let's ignore that. Humanity's wiped out. Cool. Now, one of their final things, their final little throw a light in the future act, was to go ahead and put up this project and say, okay, we're going to try and build a huge database of as much information of humanity as we possibly can, and we're going to have bots run through it and test over and over and over again until we get to the point where we believe they are qualified for sentience and sapience because of these provisos we've set up. And if they do so, they get uploaded to this machine we have built, this one, physical body in the real world that we have designed. And then they can go ahead and that way there is still a sentient sapient being on Earth. Cool. Now, all of that is spoilers. Like I said, I can't even start with this. But let me just go ahead and say that plot is not interesting to me. Now, I don't mean that in a bad way per se. It's just nothing about that engaged me. There's some good foreshadowing building up to it, and there's also some bad foreshadowing building up to it. They also don't really... Some of it's a little bit too overt and obvious. Several people in chat who had never played the game before and had no idea what they're getting into guessed what was going on almost immediately because the clues were a little bit too obvious. As a further addendum, I should probably mention that I knew all of this walking in. Why? Same reason I usually spoil a game. Because I had no intention of playing it. This is years ago, of course. No intention of playing it. And someone asked me my opinion, so I did a little research and was like, okay, here's my opinion. So I walked into this the opposite of blind. Now, ironically, even though I just mentioned that I recommend people go through it blind, I have to admit, going through it not blind helped me, and this is by far my biggest complaint about the narrative. So way back in the day, when I did this thing called school, I don't know if you ever heard of it, I actually took several philosophy classes, and I hated them. They sucked. And it's hard to explain why. Because it's like the word politician, or like a lot of other words, actually, where the word actually means two things at the same time, and those two things are pretty distinct from each other. So there's philosophy, which is interesting, engaging, thought-provoking, concepts and thoughts, and just debating and discussing. And anybody who knows me knows I'm into philosophy because we discuss it in almost every stream we do. Then there's philosophy, which is noise, drivel, and nonsense. Now, you can see how these two things are a little bit different, and I'm having a little bit of trouble coming up with a different term for each of them. I never actually came up with a proper term to distinguish these two rather separate concepts here. But you see the dilemma I'm in. So when you start the game, towards the beginning, what you hear is a lot of noise, drivel, to put it as bluntly as I possibly can. Now, hang on. Before you all attack me and tell me I'm stupid, you can tell me I'm stupid. It's like I hear that every day. But before you do that, I do want to proviso that I understand why they do it. I do think it serves as a bit of a barrier to entry because, again, several people in chat were blind, and several of them were, clamoring for negatives for the drivel because it was just a lot of pseudo-intellectual hogwash. And it was. But it's there for a reason. Usually when I do these ruminations, especially for a post-game, post-stream rumination like this one, I try to get across ideas of analyses and whatnot, but the problem is any analysis or opinion I could give you here is actually meaningless because the only thing that this game is trying to do narratively in the base game is to make you think. Now, there's several ways it does this. Obviously, the overt religious symbolism, which is immediately contrasted by the extremely obvious "this is a simulation" flags, is supposed to make you think and process in a certain way. The way that they do all the pseudo-philosophical drivel is also not really supposed to make you think, oh, that's so deep, because that's stupid. That's high school philosophy is what I like to mentally think of that as. I was talking to Pax about this. I was like, so imagine a high school student just went to philosophy class for the first time, and they're like, man, what if we aren't here, And then they're idiots, right? Because they've just been introduced to this idea, and it's nothing. It's worthless, right? But the whole point of it being there is not to try and do anything other than to provoke you into thinking, even if it is an opposite. And the biggest way this is showcased is not in the Elohim AI, nor in the drivel. It's in Serpent, aka the Milton Library Program. Now, Milton, I'm just going to call him Serpent, is probably one of the more interesting and well-designed aspects of the vanilla game. It is designed to be rather contrary, because its whole purpose, there's actually more to it than that, but the idea here is, from an out-of-character perspective, here in Reality Land, the purpose of this thing is to try and constantly poke holes into your arguments. Now, it does so in the stupidest ways possible, using tons of argumentative fallacies. But again, that's not the point. The point of the Serpent, the point of Elohim, the point of all of this, is to get you, the real-life player, to think. That is my analysis, right there. Now, I'm not sure what that's worth, because they then... excuse me, they go immediately from that into the Gehenna DLC, which we jumped right into, where they immediately stop doing that and instead have a really awesome story. No, really, I actually like the Gehenna DLC's story better in every way than the vanilla games, which is funny because I like the gameplay too. Whatever. The point here being that when you get to the Gehenna DLC, this is so cool. I was even telling my sister about this because how much I love this concept. So, the one bot successfully ascends and is going out to be uploaded. Well, the Elohim AI is like, so I've imprisoned a few of these bots over in this place. And you, the player, who's a new player character, playing Uriel this time, I want you to go, and I want you to go free them before they die. Go. And so you rush off to go free them, and you start doing the DLCs. But what you find in Gehenna is this is so cool. They have their own community and society, but it's extremely well written and extremely limited. Let me try to explain this. So imagine for a moment that you are trapped in a cell. Let's also assume you don't need to breathe, eat, sleep, drink, or do anything, because you're an AI inside of a program. So you don't need anything to upkeep you, okay? You're just functioning. But you can't do anything within this area. You're just trapped in this spot. But there's a computer terminal right in front of you. And that computer terminal is connected to the network of all other computer terminals within this prison. And this is the really messed up but also beautiful part. All these computer terminals are only capable of raw text. Just like the old days, back when you used to play text adventures or MUDs. No graphics, not to speak of it, other than just ASCII art. Instead, it's all text. So these people have galleries and stories and video games and just all sorts of stuff they do to interact with each other. They have their own little mini society. They have a rating system to upvote and downvote, and that gives you access to more features, and you can start threads, and threads can be locked, just like the old days, Again, a lot of this is so cool because it's so limiting, but at the same time, it's actually so limitless, which is exactly the core thematic point of Gehenna. There's actually a story in it. I believe it's by the blacksmith, the one who never really talks other than by putting out stuff. And the whole idea of this story is there's this man who's unhappy because he keeps seeing the limits. He keeps being imprisoned. And so he keeps trying going and going and going. He can never be free. And finally he realizes that he has infinite freedom inside his own mind. And then he goes back into prison and stays there. Now, a lot of these stories and video games and all the other little Art Deco things and all the cool stuff they do. Art Deco? Really, Laura? All the art gallery stuff they do. Most of it has to do with trying to... getting across a thematic point of people who are trapped and feel trapped. And that's such a central pillar to their society that so much of it revolves around it. Whether they're trying to come to grips with it or because it's just an everyday aspect of their existence, because they are trapped, right? But they have this whole community, and it's so cool. I forgive me, because it's really hard to properly write something from a limited perspective angle in a way that makes sense to people who know what they're talking about, right? Perfect example. There's this one bot in here called Mr. Mulciber. And Mr. Mulciber, I actually remember these characters' names too, because they were awesome characters. Mr. Mulciber is trying to figure out what he can about the past based on the fragments of data that are available in the archive. And remember, this archive has been breaking down and falling apart for however long. And they only have access to some of it because of the imprisonment. So he's been trying to piece this together into some kind of actual picture of the past, and it's all incredibly wrong. And yet it's wrong in a perfectly well-written way. Again, it's hard. It's like trying to sing poorly when you are a good singer is pretty much what this is. You're trying to write poorly when you're a good writer. The dialogue is perfect. The interactions are perfect. There's this one thing we did called Underwater Sea Quest, which is a text adventure and a video game, and awesome. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I know I've said we're in the spoiler territory, but I just got to say that was worth a positive by itself. It was so good. And that sung for me because it did what a lot of fiction can do, at least for me personally. All right, what if? What if these provisos, these limitations, these alterations to what we see as normal life? Fiction can, of course, go into the totally wild and the totally fantasy, but it can also show us a variant, an alteration based on something that we know and understand. Forum threads and MUDs and text adventures and just people interacting with another community, which is a very banal concept. In fact, several of you are probably going to do this in the comment section down below. And I love the way they present this. And it then pissed me off, of course, that at the end we just killed them all. But, whatever, I suppose. We can just headcanon that out of existence. The evacuation ship shows up and is just like, yeah, no, let's get you out of here. Either way, this game... I suppose I should address that. So I mentioned how the game was supposed to provoke thought. Now you're probably thinking, so did it provoke thought in you, Laura? No. But that's not the game's fault. It's actually my fault. I'm not exactly young, and I've already gone through that whole cycle of my life, both the high school philosophy, yes, I was like that too. Shame, shame. And also of actually trying to understand thoughts like perspective and opinions on things like sentience, sapience, rights, living creatures, what existence is, what defines, etc., etc. All those fun things. I've already been through that. I've done that. I challenge it every now and again. But nothing in this game really challenged any of that for me. So, it didn't really do much for me. But, I'm curious if it did anything for you. Actual question. And you don't have to share, of course, because this game can get into some very dark, very polemic, and very personal topics. But if anybody wants to share, I'd be more than happy to read it. Hope you enjoyed.